Welcome to Mr. Ambassador Rob Zaagmaan. And it is a special book written by Eddie de Wind. This is much different than many others books because the book was written by Eddie de Wind just after the Auschwitz was empty and the people, the rest of the people went on a long march with the Germans, tried to, knew that the Russians are coming close. So he was living in the somewhere. And what we know now, that the book was published many years ago, but for 2-3 years ago, the book was published in Denmark. And please, Mr. Ambassador, tell us a little bit more about the story. Welcome.
Thank you very much, first of all, for turning up late on a sunny day, on Sunday even. It's great weather outside, so you must have made a very conscious decision to be here this afternoon. 1 year late, I must say. Jacob had already invited me most graciously a long time ago, but then, of course, our common friend Corona came in the way. And I think the organizers of the Jewish Culture Festival must have been thanking their good luck and the powers above that everything could go through this time and in a very smooth manner with lots of attendance, I also understand. I can only congratulate you, Jacob, and your co-organizers, Mrs. Silber, on a very successful week, which isn't over, first of all, not just because I still have to speak, but also because there are some other things coming after this. There's a second reason why I would like, first of all, I feel it a great honor to be allowed to speak on such an occasion about such an important subject. The second reason why I'm grateful, Jacob, is because it drew my attention to the book by Eddie de Wind, which in Danish is called Endestation Auschwitz, which is the literal translation of the Dutch title, Endestation Auschwitz. I will not only be speaking about the book, I will also try to give you some sort of context from my own country about the persecution of the Jews, the context in which the book was written. Every year on 4 May, Denmark celebrates its liberation from Nazi occupation and tyranny. For the Netherlands, Liberation Day is the next day, 5th of May. Like the Danes, we Dutch will not forget the hard efforts made by the Allies to free us and the steep price they paid for that in blood. Today, 6th June, it is exactly 77 years ago that the final push for the liberation of Western Europe began with the massive landings on the Normandy beaches. At the end of that day, 4,500 young Allied soldiers had lost their lives. Many tens of thousands were to follow before our nations were free again. In the Netherlands, 4 May is Remembrance Day. On that day, we commemorate all those civilians and soldiers who have been killed or murdered in the Kingdom of the Netherlands or anywhere else in the world in war situations or during peacekeeping operations since the outbreak of the Second World War. The word murdered refers in particular to the Shoah, the genocide perpetrated against the Jewish communities in Europe. We remember on 4 May, but on 5 May, we look to the future. Each year, the commemorations on both days have a specific theme to give them focus and to connect the past, the present, and the future. And the overarching theme of the commemoration these past few years has been passing on freedom. And each year, a different aspect of freedom is highlighted. In 2017, special attention was given to the power of personal stories as a means to pass on freedom. These personal stories deal with the consequences of war and oppression. They are about death, misery, pain and fear. They are about the dark side of mankind, about humiliation, betrayal, lies, and cowardice. These stories make one realize what it is not to live in freedom as we do nowadays, how it is to live under the threat of nighttime razzias, what it is having to bow to a foreign emperor. But they can also be about human heroism, about courage and sacrifice, about standing up for what is good and decent, and about love in terrible times. One world-famous example of such a personal story is, of course, Anne Frank's diary, published in Danish as Bouwhoezel, which is the exact translation of the Dutch book title, Het Achterhuis, the house in the back of the house. Fiction, too, can be a powerful instrument for conveying deeper truths about the human experience. One example is a novel by Dutch Jewish author Marga Minko, with the title Het Bittere Kruid. Its Danish translation, Bittere Urte, was published very recently here in Denmark. And of course, there are personal recollections, immediate personal recollections presented, perhaps in a slightly fictionalized form, such as the book by Eddie de Wint, Endestation Auschwitz. But perhaps I should give you some historical context for Eddie de Wint's book. The Netherlands was invaded by Nazi Germany on 10 May 1940. After 5 days of bitter fighting and a devastating bombardment on the city of Rotterdam, we capitulated and a harsh occupation began. This occupation was to last until the 5th of May 1945. Especially fierce was the Nazi persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands, of whom there were, in 1940, about 140,000. Most of them, obviously, Dutch nationals, but there were 20,000 immigrants and refugees from other countries, mainly Germany and Eastern Europe. Anne Frank and her family were among those immigrants and refugees. These Jews were fully integrated into Dutch society. Their children went to school with Dutch children. They worked, they were members of Dutch society. But soon the Germans started introducing measures to separate the Jews from the rest of the population. They were dismissed from public service. They had to register with the authorities, which the large majority did because they had no inkling of what was coming for them. And this is something which also returns in the book by Eddie de Wint. At first, there was not much resistance among the other Dutch against these measures. Many organizations, clubs, and cinemas even removed or barred Jews at their own initiative. The Dutch National Socialist Party became ever more aggressive, and soon the raids started. But resentment against the anti-Jewish measures was also growing, and in February 1941, a massive strike broke out in Amsterdam, the capital of my country. This was the first large-scale demonstration in Europe against anti-Jewish measures, but the strike was broken by force of arms. Life became ever harsher for the Jews. They were excluded from all walks of life. Many had to give up their work. Some Dutch employers made use of the new legislation to summarily dismiss their Jewish employees. Jews were forbidden to marry non-Jews, and in April 1942, it became mandatory for them to wear the yellow Star of David on their outer clothes. Their property was seized. And then the large-scale raids and deportations started. The Germans would come for them at night at their homes. They would raid the homes for the elderly, the orphanages, and the hospitals. Many Jews tried to avoid being deported. Perhaps 3,000 managed to escape abroad. 3,000 out of 140,000. A number of babies and small children were smuggled out of the country by the Dutch resistance. Many Dutch Jews went underground into hiding. However, finding people who were prepared to hide them was difficult. If caught, they could be deported to a camp themselves, or worse. And where would they get the food stamps for those in hiding? After all food was rationed. It had to be kept totally secret, of course. Not easy, certainly not if there were children in the household where the Jews were hiding, or where there were nosy neighbors. There was the ever-present danger of betrayal. But in the end, about 28,000 Jews went underground, of whom 4,000 were children. Still, about 1/3 of those were betrayed or discovered and then deported, and Frank and her family among them. Of the 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands, a full 107,000 were deported to the death camps. Adults, the elderly, the children, there were no exceptions. 61,000 were sent to Auschwitz, 34,000 to Sobibor. Overall, only 5,200 Jews survived the horror of the camps. But from Auschwitz and Sobibor camps, only 500 came back. Eddie de Wind and his wife Friedel were 2 of them. Of all the 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands, only 1/4 survived the war. How was it possible that the Nazi anti-Jewish measures were so effective in my country? On 26 January 2020, at the Dutch National Auschwitz commemoration, Prime Minister Mark Rutte apologized on behalf of the Dutch government for its attitude regarding the persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands during the Second World War. The authorities had failed in their duty to protect and to act as guardians of justice and security, he said. The bitter consequences of the registration and deportation of the Jews were not recognized in a timely and adequate fashion. Too many Dutch civil servants did what the Nazi occupier demanded of them, not asking moral questions of themselves, but putting duty to the system before duty to humanity. Individual civil servants did try to frustrate the persecution of the Jews, as did the Dutch resistance, but it was all too little and too late, said Prime Minister Mark Rutte. That is not to belittle those who did do their utmost to help and to resist, least of all those who lost their lives because of their actions. The organization Yad Vashem in Israel grants non-Jews who risk their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust the title of Righteous Among the Nations, and 5,351 Dutch women and men were given this great honor. One example of personal courage was the public lecture given on 26 November 1940 by Professor Rudolf Cleveringa of Leiden University. A lecture in which he protested against the dismissal of his Jewish colleagues. Jewish students were dismissed as well. It was only with the help of his professors that Eddie de Wind was able to graduate in medicine as a doctor. He was the last Jewish student in Leiden to receive his degree certificate. Eddie then left for Amsterdam to secretly complete his psychiatry training in the private homes of his professors. The horrible events of the war and the Holocaust ended 75 years ago. But they did not really end. Those events are still with us and hold an essential meaning even today. To remember the Holocaust is to remember the victims, those who died and those who survived but died inside. Because what does survival mean when one's whole family has been murdered? One crucial question confronting us today is, how do we keep the memory alive in order to help prevent it happening again? How can young people know about these events which even their parents have not experienced? In the Netherlands, this is done through education and commemoration. Children aged about 10 to 11 are told about the meaning of war and freedom in the lives of children elsewhere, of children in the past. They read about Anne Frank. Many will visit a historical site or listen to an eyewitness speak about occupation, resistance, and the persecution of the Jews. Secondary school students learn to connect the war and the Holocaust to modern day developments, to make clear its continuing importance to the world today. Several museums devote attention to the persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands. And the 3 former concentration camps where the Jews went through before deported on to the death camps, Westerbork, Vught, Amersfoort. These camps in the Netherlands are designated national monuments and feature exhibitions and educational facilities. Westerbork is the camp where Eddie de Wint was imprisoned and where he met his wife, Friedel, whom he married there in the camp itself, and with whom he was subsequently deported to Auschwitz. Nationally, the commemoration of the Holocaust is part of the remembrance of all Dutch victims of the war on the 4th of May. Other events are attended by those directly involved, usually spanning several generations. Let me mention only 2. One is, of course, the annual Auschwitz commemoration, which is held at the Auschwitz Monument in Amsterdam. It is held on the Sunday nearest to 27 January, Liberation Day for the former inmates of Auschwitz. And Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day is observed at the site in Amsterdam, a theater where the Jews were held before they were deported. Of course, remembering the Holocaust is an international cause. The Netherlands, like Denmark, is a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which has the purpose to put political and social leader support behind the need for Holocaust education, remembrance, and research, both nationally and internationally. Remembering the Holocaust also means thinking about what made it possible in the first place. To think about what can be done to prevent something like that from happening ever again. And there is a role for individuals as well, of course, because we individuals can ask ourselves, who am I? What do I believe in? What would I do in a given situation? And of course, what should my country, the Netherlands, Denmark, stand for? And there is all the more reason for this, as the demons of the past have not been driven out. It is shameful and disconcerting that in 20th century Europe, anti-Semitism and xenophobia have been on the rise again for some time. Our Jewish compatriots feel increasingly insecure in the Netherlands as well. Already in the 1980s, at the end of his life, Eddie de Wint himself became more and more concerned about the run-up to what we are seeing today. But how is this possible after all the things that have happened? Has history been forgotten despite our best efforts to commemorate, to teach, to learn? Commemoration is crucial, but it cannot be a substitute for attitude and action on our parts. In our daily lives, through our daily conduct, we must prevent this cancer from spreading further. And there still is a crucial role for personal stories to bring home to everyone concerned what it meant to people who had to go through that hell. Many survivors decided that they lived to tell their story so that others might learn from it. Like Otto Frank, who published his daughter Anne's diary and hoped that her story would contribute to reconciliation and peace. Or Jules Shellfish, who barely made it through Sobibor and later in life started talking to German and Dutch school children about his experience. I met him in Munich, where I received him and other Dutch survivors from the Sobibor death camp at my residence. There was a number of descendants from Jews who had been deported to Sobibor and had not survived. these people came to testify in the trial against the Ukrainian camp guard, John Demjanjuk. It was a very moving and humiliating experience to talk to these people and hear firsthand their stories. Jules died in 2016, but other witnesses continue to tell their stories, and one of them is Rudy Cortissos, who was also in Munich. Rudy lost his parents to Sobibor. He himself only avoided deportation, as he told me, thanks to his blonde hair, blue eyes, and the help of ordinary Dutch families. And to this day, he, like others, including Eddie de Wint, asks himself, why me? Why not the others? Why did I survive? What did I do to deserve this? Eddie de Wint too wanted to stay alive to tell other people about what he had experienced and to convince them that this had really happened. Endestation Auschwitz is an account of the abominations still written in the belly of the beast. In the weeks after the SS had left the camp, Eddie wrote down his experiences in a scavenged notebook. A notebook of the kind the SS would use to write down the numbers of the Jewish forced laborers selected for the gas chamber. The script is now in the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. Eddie himself regarded his book not so much as a historical report on what had happened, but as a story with a universal significance, one which shows how some people, under the most inhumane of circumstances, continue to support each other, love each other, and how they are able to maintain a certain strength of mind. But it is also a story which shows how intolerance and feelings of superiority can, in extreme cases, lead to the most unimaginable deeds. Eddie's book is not only about torture and humiliation, about the maddening arbitrariness of the selections and the constant agony, but also about his wife Friedel, his longing for her, his hope to see her again, his despair that he may not. It is also a love story, in a terrible setting, but still a love story. In Auschwitz, there were only 10 meters between Eddie's barracks and the barracks of where Friedel was detained. Friedel was one among the women on whom medical experiments were performed by the infamous Dr. Josef Mengele and a colleague of his, a Dr. Klauberg. Eddie describes how skilled he became to cross those 10 meters and to see Friedel every now and then, and also how reckless he was at times. And one day it almost meant his death, because one of the men conducting the experiments caught him. And the next morning, Eddie had to go to Birkenau, the camp with the gas chambers, only 3 kilometers away. The SS placed him in a Bauhof commando, which meant that he was continuously carrying stones, sleepers, and iron beams, a labor which will kill you after only a short time. There were selections every day who could live and who could not. But after 5 weeks, Friedel managed to get him out by asking the camp doctor, Dr. Mengele, if her husband could go back to Auschwitz. And strangely enough, Dr. Mengele had a human moment, and he allowed Eddie to return to his barracks. And Eddie explained this not as something in favor of Mengele, but only it condemned him, this Mengele, even more. Eddie thought Mengele and the older SS men were the biggest bastards in the camp because they could be sympathetic and humane. They still knew the difference between good and evil. The younger SS guards were so indoctrinated from a very early age onward that in Eddie's eyes, they didn't know any better. They couldn't know any better, but the older ones could, and they were the real evil in the camp. After the war, Eddie treated patients with concentration camp syndrome and published scientific articles about them. He had become a psychiatrist. His first article dates from 1949 and is called Confrontation with Death. In it, he describes the 6 very traumatizing phases that newcomers to the camp go through. And he also analyzes who has a chance of survival. A question which bothered himself quite a lot. Why me? Why not the others? And his conclusion was that the survivors, or the ones who have stand a chance at survival, are the people who can quickly find an attitude that makes them last just a little longer, by resigning themselves to the fact that they will die, and yet have the vitality not to make mistakes at critical moments, such as attracting attention or giving an unwanted answer. Eddie de Wint did not think that people owed it to their personal qualities if they had survived the camp. Survival was pure coincidence, he said. But from reading his book, it is clear that Eddie himself was not only lucky, which he was at times, but also smart and courageous at the right moments. One telling example from the book is how he evaded destruction when he arrived in Auschwitz. First, Eddie is beaten and made to join the group with the weak because he had only eyes for Friedel and did not answer when asked how old he was. And there is no second chance in these death camps. Bang, there you go. And there he stood among the old men, the blind, the infirm. He didn't know what their fate would be, but he sensed that he had to get out of that group. And he seized his chance when camp doctor Mengele wanted to know if there were any doctors among them. He jumped forward with 3 other men. Mengele asked one of them what kind of illnesses there were in the Dutch camp, Westerbork, where they had come from. Mengele turned away annoyed when this doctor started muttering something about eye diseases. He was clearly not interested in that. And at that point, Eddie said, "You probably mean infectious diseases?" There were sporadic cases of scarlet fever, which were innocent in nature. Mengele then asked, "Was there typhoid fever?" "No, not a single case." Then Mengele turned to his adjutant and said, "We'll take this one with us." And that's how Eddie escaped the group of the infirm, the weak, who were immediately sent on to the gas chambers. I said that the book is also a love story. After the liberation of Auschwitz, Eddie continued working there as a doctor in the service of the Red Army. They needed doctors to treat those who were still alive. After these 3 months, he traveled to the Netherlands, and on 24 July 1945, after a journey via Odessa and Marseille in France, he arrived in the eastern Dutch town of Enschede. When he told an employee of the Red Cross who he was, the man told him that a Mrs. de Wint had arrived from Auschwitz shortly before. She was nearby, and the same day, Eddie and Friedel were reunited. But no, there is no happy ending here. After selling the belongings of their murdered relatives, because nobody else had returned, and paying the back taxes, because the local authorities in Amsterdam had calculated the back taxes of those people who had been sent to the camps. They moved into a house in Amsterdam South. There they made each other so unhappy that they would eventually divorce. Eddie's son, Mechel, from his second marriage, said in an interview, "They were too badly violated. My father mainly psychologically, Friedel also physically because of the experiments. She suffered from tuberculosis, and the effects of the experiments performed on her meant that she could no longer have children." When Eddie remarried a non-Jewish woman in 1957 and started a family, Friedel was left angry and bitter. So this love story has a very unhappy ending. After the war, Eddie, as a psychiatrist, wrote about the traumas of others, but never of the traumas he suffered himself or those of his own children. He was one of the first not just to look at the immediate survivors of the camps, but also to look at what it did to the generations after that. He did not write about himself, he did not write about his children, although his son said there was one case study which came awfully close to what I experienced as the son of an Auschwitz survivor. Even his book, Endestation Auschwitz, does not seem to be about him. It is written in the third person, as if he wanted to put distance between himself and the person living through that hell which was Auschwitz. Although there was another reason as well, not knowing whether he would fall into Russian, German, or other hands, and wishing to protect himself, he used the pen name Hans van Dam. So whenever you read Hans in the story, it is himself who is there. In an interview 2 years ago, Eddie's son, Melchior, said that as a 15-year-old, he was watching a horror movie about zombies on television. His father sat down with him and asked what they were, zombies. Melchior said, I explained that they were creatures that had come back from the dead, and then he got all confused. He walked out of the room, his father did, and it wasn't until much later that I, his son, realized he saw himself as a zombie. He had embraced death in order to live on and carried with him the evil that had crept into him. Eddie de Wint wanted to stay alive, to tell other people about what he had experienced and convince them that this had really happened. But in the festive mood after the liberation, the general public was not interested in his story. Eddie de Wint died in 1987, 71 years old. But in 2020, 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army, and due to the untiring efforts of Mechel and other family members, Eddie's enduring deepest wish that one day Endestation Auschwitz would be successfully published was finally fulfilled. And I'm sure he would have been very happy to know that it is now also available in Danish. Thank you for your attention. Yep. Preferably in English. If it's in Danish, I would require assistance. Yes. I can read Danish, but understanding the spoken word is still a bit hard for me. I'm sorry, and I apologize for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. From what you told us, Dr. Mengele seems to have saved the man you talk about 2 times. Do you think he did it the second time because he remembered him from the first time when he said, I can use him?
That's an excellent question. I did read the book in Dutch, I have to say. I don't think I encountered that. It could be that it was just a moment of humanity or arbitrariness on the part of Mengele. When you have to see that the system of doctors in Auschwitz was quite elaborate, not to care for the inmates, but to perform experiments. There were some who were employed to care for the inmates, and Eddie was one of them. But they worked, there's quite a hierarchical system, and the upper doctor, which was Mengele, would come only once or twice or 3 times a year. There were others who would come more often. So I doubt whether Mengele really remembered this particular Jew, to put it that way. And I say Jew in such a way, but between quotation marks, obviously. So I don't think so. But it was just a quirk of him. It could be that Friedel reminded him who Eddie was, one of your doctors. And then, but for this, Mengele could also have decided, what do I care? So I think it was probably a coincidence. But it's true, and I wouldn't say save his life. He took a decision, Mengele, which helped Eddie to live a little bit longer, but not with the objective of saving him. That was not Mengele's way of working, I guess.
More questions?
Thank you. It's interesting that the book is only coming now in a lot of countries. How would you explain the interest now to have the book?
As you may know, Eddie de Wint tried to publish his book very shortly after he had returned to the Netherlands. He even found a publisher, but that publisher had difficulty in selling the book because nobody was interested. There was too much going on, festivities. People were not interested in the fate of the Jews. They were not interested in the fate of those Dutch people coming from the Netherlands East Indies who had survived the Japanese internment camps. And I know that because my mother was one of them. And when they came, it was not just a cold country because there was winter here, but there was also cold people. And the same applied to the reception that the Jews got, although their fate had been much worse than that of the inmates in the Japanese camps. And afterwards, he couldn't find a publisher, even though he kept on trying. There were people who really saw the value of the book, but somehow it was not a commercial proposition. After Eddie died in 87, pardon me, his son took up the burden and tried to find someone who would publish it. And the 75-year anniversary of the liberation of the camp was probably such an occasion, after so many years of commemoration all over the world. Even in New Zealand, where I worked before, there is a lot of attention to for the Holocaust. But that 75th year anniversary was sort of a marker. And that opened a lot of eyes, generated a lot of interest. But the fact that instead of a couple of languages, or just a publication in Dutch, which was Eddie's objective, it's now translated into over 30 other languages, that was totally unexpected. And that I cannot really explain, because on the other hand, we do see a resurgence of anti-Semitism. So perhaps this is a good sign, that people see that things are going wrong and want to do something about it and want to learn about what really happened. I think we always need to be hopeful and optimistic. In itself, it's not enough. You also have to act and to have a certain attitude, as I said. But this kind of phenomenon gives me some hope.
Last question.
This is about something else. About the house of Anna Frank. It used to be a museum, and I read in a Danish newspaper some time ago that it's permanently closed. Is it true? And if yes, why?
I have not heard anything about it. I don't think it's true. I mean, there would have been quite an uproar in the Netherlands if it had happened. There would have been an uproar internationally if it had happened. Yes. Do you remember in which newspaper or which medium this was?
Politiken.
Politiken. How long ago?
I can't remember. A very short notice.
No. Yeah. Well, there is a possibly renovation, but I can't imagine that. No. So that's good news, I would imagine. Yes, yeah.
We have just shown the ballet about Anne Frank.
Have you? Okay.
At Ventureskoven, and some people said they had the experience of their lives. It was a fantastic, moving, emotional.
Yeah. Now, and Frank is world famous. Eddie de Wint is becoming well known. From my own reading, I can really recommend the book. Even though it deals with terrible things, it also deals with a beautiful thing, the love between Eddie and his wife Friedel. The style in which it is written is it's almost businesslike. He doesn't use big words to bring home the suffering. It's a very factual description of things that happen, but for that, all the more powerful. And written, as I said, immediately at the end of after the last German guards, the last SS had left. So it was all fresh in his mind when he wrote those things. I think it's really very well written for a doctor who had no literary experience. And it shows you the importance of mutual support, but also the importance of keeping your sanity and trying to maintain some sort of independence of mind in a camp.
Well, I can recommend the book as well. It's translated last year into Danish. If you have the app Bookmate, you can hear it as what's it called? Lydbog.
Audiobook.
Audiobook.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be easier to go through, so you can go forth and back. I don't find the book that it's a kind of book you hear from the start to the very end. You need to have some breaks. But that's how it is with those kind of books. So I thank you very much.
You're welcome.
For coming and making this lecture, and from the greetings from the festival. We have a few bottles of wine. Thank you.
Thank you very much.